The CNN studio fell silent as Kamala Harris leaned forward, her eyes locked on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, with a look that could freeze water. What happened next would shock the political world and create the most viral moment of 2025. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and millions of viewers across America were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. "Jasmine, you're out of your league," Harris said, her voice dripping with condescension that made everyone in the studio uncomfortable. "You're a freshman congresswoman who thinks she knows better than a former vice president." The words hung in the air like a challenge, each syllable designed to humiliate and diminish the young Texas representative sitting across from her. But Crockett didn't back down. Instead, she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, or even a nervous one. It was the kind of smile that promised devastation was coming. The kind of expression that sent chills down the spines of everyone watching. What she said next would not only destroy Harris on live television, but turn the entire Democratic Party upside down and reshape the political landscape forever. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation that left political pundits speechless and social media in absolute chaos, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button because you definitely won't want to miss what happens when political heavyweights clash like this. Trust me, what you're about to see will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about power dynamics in Washington. The studio lights blazed with an intensity that seemed to match the brewing confrontation. Two of the most powerful women in Democratic politics sat across from each other, separated by a small table but divided by an ocean of political philosophy and personal ambition. Harris, sitting confidently in her perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, thought she was about to school a rookie in the art of political warfare. Her posture screamed authority and experience, the kind of presence that had intimidated countless opponents throughout her career. Crockett, dressed in a sharp purple blazer that seemed to glow under the studio lights, appeared calm and collected on the surface. But anyone who knew her could see the steel in her eyes, the quiet confidence of someone who had been underestimated her entire life and had learned to use that to her advantage. She sat with the poise of a chess master who had already calculated the next 10 moves, while her opponent was still figuring out the rules of the game. This wasn't supposed to be a fight. When CNN booked both women for Anderson Cooper 360, it was supposed to be a simple panel discussion about criminal justice reform, the kind of policy-focused conversation that usually put viewers to sleep within the first 5 minutes. The producers were expecting the usual political theater of polite disagreement and carefully worded criticism. Nobody, not even the seasoned veterans in the control room, expected what was about to unfold. But when Harris decided to publicly humiliate Crockett on national television, she had no idea she was about to walk into a political ambush that would end her career aspirations forever. Harris had clearly come prepared for a different kind of fight, one where her experience and national profile would automatically give her the upper hand. She had probably spent the afternoon before the show practicing her talking points and preparing to demonstrate why she was still the future of the Democratic Party. What Harris didn't realize was that Crockett had been preparing for this moment for months, studying every aspect of the former vice president's record, cataloging every contradiction, every flip-flop, every moment when Harris had chosen political expediency over progressive principles. While Harris was rehearsing her standard stump speech lines, Crockett was building a case that would demolish the carefully constructed image Harris had spent years creating. The irony was delicious in its completeness. Harris, the former prosecutor who had built her career on preparation and attention to detail, was about to be outlawyered by a former public defender who knew exactly how to dismantle a weak case when she saw one. The student was about to become the teacher, and the lesson was going to be broadcast live to millions of Americans hungry for authentic political leadership. Kamala Harris sat at the CNN desk like she owned it, and in many ways, she felt like she did. After serving as vice president under Biden, she had been positioning herself as the elder stateswoman of the Democratic Party, the experienced hand who could guide the party through turbulent political waters. With her perfectly styled hair that never seemed to move regardless of the circumstances, and that trademark laugh ready to deploy whenever she needed to deflect a difficult question, she exuded the confidence of someone who had been on the national stage for years and believed she belonged there. Her resume was impressive by any standard. She had prosecuted criminals as California's Attorney General, served in the United States Senate, where she had gained national attention for her aggressive questioning during confirmation hearings and stood one heartbeat away from the presidency for 4 years. In her mind, she was political royalty, someone who had earned her place at the top of the Democratic hierarchy through years of hard work and calculated political moves. She spoke with the authority of someone who had negotiated with world leaders and made decisions that affected millions of lives. But Harris had a problem that was growing larger by the day. Her approval ratings were tanking faster than a lead balloon, and no amount of professional polish seemed to be able to stop the bleeding. Young Democrats, the very demographic she needed to energize if she wanted to maintain her political relevance, were abandoning her in droves. They called her out of touch, fake, and too willing to compromise progressive values for political convenience. Progressive activists who had once seen her as a champion had turned against her prosecutorial record, pointing to the thousands of people she had sent to prison for minor drug offenses while laughing about her own marijuana use. The criticism was getting under her skin, and it showed in moments like this when she felt the need to reassert her dominance over younger party members who dared to question her leadership. She needed to reclaim her position as the party's future, and she thought demolishing a freshman congresswoman on national television would be the perfect way to show everyone that she was still the queen bee of Democratic politics. It was a miscalculation that would prove to be one of the most devastating in modern political history. Jasmine Crockett represented everything Harris used to be before years of political calculation had worn away her authentic edges. The 42-year-old Texas Democrat had burst onto the national scene with her fiery speeches and viral social media presence that connected with people in a way that Harris's carefully focus-grouped messaging never could. A former public defender turned civil rights lawyer, she had won her congressional seat by promising to fight for working families, not corporate donors, and her voting record showed she meant every word of those promises. Crockett's background was fundamentally different from Harris's privileged path to power. She had grown up in a working-class family in Texas, put herself through law school, and spent years in the trenches of the criminal justice system defending people who couldn't afford million-dollar legal teams. She had seen firsthand how the system failed regular people, and that experience had shaped her into the kind of politician who viewed every policy decision through the lens of how it would affect the most vulnerable members of society. Since arriving in Congress, Crockett had been making waves with the kind of authentic passion that couldn't be manufactured by political consultants. Her committee appearances went viral regularly, not because she was trying to create viral moments, but because she spoke with the kind of genuine conviction that cut through the usual political noise. She had called out Republican hypocrisy with surgical precision and wasn't afraid to challenge Democratic leadership when they disappointed progressives who had voted for change and gotten more of the same. Unlike Harris, who seemed to calculate every word for maximum political advantage and had become famous for saying a lot while meaning very little, Crockett spoke from the heart and the people loved her for it. She didn't need focus groups to tell her what working families needed because she had lived that experience herself. She didn't need polling data to understand the frustration of communities that had been promised reform and received empty rhetoric instead. The stakes of this confrontation went far beyond criminal justice reform or even the personal rivalry between two ambitious politicians. This was about the soul of the Democratic Party and the direction it would take as it faced an uncertain political future. Would they follow the establishment path represented by Harris, with her corporate connections, cautious messaging, and willingness to compromise progressive values whenever it became politically convenient? Or would they embrace the progressive fire of leaders like Crockett, who put people over politics and meant what they said when they talked about fighting for justice? The country was watching with an intensity that surprised even seasoned political observers. Progressive activists had their phones ready to clip whatever happened next, knowing that moments like this could define the future of their movement. Conservative commentators were salivating at the chance to watch Democrats tear each other apart on national television, providing them with endless content for their own shows and social media feeds. Somewhere in the background, Democratic Party leaders were holding their breath, knowing that this moment could reshape their political landscape in ways that would reverberate for years to come. They had spent months trying to paper over the growing divide between the establishment and progressive wings of the party, and now two of their most prominent voices were about to have that fight in front of the entire nation. The tension in the studio was thick enough to cut with a knife, and everyone present could sense that something significant was about to happen. Anderson Cooper, veteran of countless political interviews and someone who had seen every kind of political theater imaginable, could sense something big was brewing. His instincts as a journalist were telling him that this wasn't going to be another boring policy discussion that viewers would forget by morning. The cameras rolled, capturing every micro-expression and subtle gesture. The nation watched, many of them unaware that they were about to witness a moment that would be studied in political science classes for decades to come. And two democratic powerhouses prepared for a collision that would change everything anyone thought they knew about power, authenticity, and the future of American politics. Anderson Cooper introduced the segment with his usual professional demeanor, his voice carrying the gravitas that had made him one of the most trusted names in television journalism. Tonight, we're discussing the future of criminal justice reform, with two of the Democratic Party's most prominent voices on this issue. Former Vice President Kamala Harris, who brings years of prosecutorial experience and executive leadership to this conversation, and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas, who has emerged as one of the most passionate advocates for reform in the House of Representatives. The discussion started normally enough, following the predictable rhythms that have governed television political discussions for decades. Cooper asked about bail reform, and both women gave their standard talking points with the kind of practiced ease that comes from years of media training. Harris spoke about her prosecutorial experience and the need for balanced approaches that protected public safety while addressing systemic inequalities. Crockett emphasized her work as a public defender and the urgent need for comprehensive reform that would address the root causes of crime, rather than just punishing its symptoms. Everything seemed civil, even friendly, with the kind of polite disagreement that political producers love, because it creates the illusion of substantive debate without actually challenging anyone's fundamental beliefs. The two women nodded respectfully when the other spoke, maintained eye contact, and even smiled at each other during transitions between questions. To the casual viewer, it looked like a normal policy discussion between two thoughtful Democratic leaders who shared common goals even if they disagreed on tactics. But experienced political observers could sense an undercurrent of tension that was building beneath the surface politeness. Harris's smile seemed a little too forced, her eye contact a little too intense. Crockett's responses were measured and professional, but there was something in her posture that suggested she was prepared for this conversation to go in a very different direction. Both women were clearly aware that they were representing more than just their individual positions. They were embodying two different visions for the future of their party. Then Cooper asked the question that lit the fuse, the moment that would transform a routine policy discussion into the most talked-about political confrontation of the year. There seems to be some tension in the Democratic Party between the more establishment approach to criminal justice and the progressive wing's calls for more radical reform. How do you two reconcile these different approaches? Is there a generational divide here that the party needs to address? Harris's entire demeanor changed in an instant. Her smile turned predatory, like a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. She had been waiting for this moment, planning for it, and now she was ready to strike. This was her opportunity to reassert her dominance over the progressive wing of the party and remind everyone why experience mattered more than enthusiasm. She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the tone she had perfected during her years as a prosecutor when she was about to destroy a defendant's credibility. Anderson, I think it's important that we have experienced voices leading these conversations, she began, her words carefully chosen but loaded with condescension. Criminal justice reform isn't a game where you can just throw around progressive talking points and hope something sticks. This is serious business that affects real people's lives, and it requires the kind of deep understanding that comes from actually working within the system. She paused for effect, letting her words sink in before delivering what she thought would be the knockout punch. She turned to look directly at Crockett, her voice taking on that condescending tone that had made her so many enemies over the years, but which she still believed demonstrated her authority and gravitas. Some of our newer members of Congress seem to think that being loud on Twitter is the same as being effective in governance, but real change requires understanding how the system actually works, not just complaining about it from the sidelines. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, even the cameramen and sound technicians, who had seen every kind of political drama imaginable, could tell that this was clearly a personal attack disguised as a policy disagreement. Harris had just accused Crockett of being all style and no substance, suggesting that her popularity was based on social media grandstanding rather than actual accomplishments. It was the kind of dismissive, elitist rhetoric that had made Harris so unpopular with younger voters, and she was doubling down on it on national television. Crockett's eyebrows raised slightly, but her voice remained calm and measured when she responded. She had been expecting something like this, and years of courtroom experience had taught her never to let an opponent see that they had gotten under her skin. I appreciate the former vice president's perspective, but I think the people of Texas sent me here precisely because the old way of doing things hasn't worked for them. Sometimes fresh eyes and new approaches are exactly what broken systems need. It was a perfectly reasonable response, diplomatic but firm, the kind of answer that might have de-escalated the situation if Harris had been interested in having an actual policy discussion. But Harris wasn't interested in policy. She was interested in establishing dominance. She had come to this interview with a specific goal: to publicly humiliate Crockett and demonstrate that the progressive wing of the party was led by naive children who didn't understand how real politics worked. That's when Harris made her fatal mistake. She let her frustration with her falling poll numbers, her jealousy of Crockett's rising popularity, and her desperate need to reassert her relevance get the better of her judgment. She abandoned any pretense of discussing policy and launched into a personal attack that would haunt her for the rest of her political career. "Jasmine, you've been in Congress for what? 2 years, Harris said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that made millions of viewers cringe. "I was prosecuting criminals and putting them behind bars when you were still in law school. Maybe you should listen to those of us who've actually done the work instead of grandstanding for the cameras." The attack was personal, dismissive, and dripping with the kind of elitist attitude that made voters sick. Harris had just accused Crockett of being all show and no substance, dismissed her experience as a public defender and civil rights lawyer, and essentially told her to sit down and shut up while the adults talked. She had done all of this on national television, in front of millions of viewers who were already skeptical of establishment politicians and their claims to superior wisdom. You could feel the energy in the studio shift immediately, like the atmospheric pressure change that happens right before a tornado touches down. Anderson Cooper's eyes widened slightly, as his journalistic instincts told him he was witnessing something explosive that would be replayed and analyzed for weeks. The camera operators instinctively tightened their shots, sensing they were about to capture a moment that would be studied in journalism schools and political science programs for years to come. Harris sat back in her chair with a satisfied smirk, thinking she had just put this upstart in her place and demonstrated why experience trumped enthusiasm every time. She probably imagined that Democratic donors would be calling her office within hours to praise her for putting the progressive wing back in its place. She had no idea that she had just walked into the political equivalent of a bear trap that would destroy everything she had spent years building. For just a moment, Crockett was silent, but it wasn't the silence of someone who had been defeated or intimidated. It was the silence of a predator calculating the perfect strike. Her eyes never left Harris's face as she processed what had just happened and planned her response. Years of legal training had taught her that the best way to destroy an opponent wasn't with emotion or personal attacks. It was with cold, hard facts, delivered with surgical precision. Harris had just dismissed her experience as a public defender, insulted her effectiveness as a congresswoman, and basically called her a social media attention seeker. On national television, in front of millions of viewers, what Harris didn't know was that Crockett had been preparing for this moment for months, studying every aspect of the former vice president's record, and waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Crockett's smile was razor-sharp as she prepared to respond, the kind of expression that trial lawyers recognize as the moment when someone is about to methodically destroy their opponent's credibility. She had spent years in courtrooms facing down prosecutors who thought they could intimidate her with their authority and experience, and she had learned that the best defense against condescension was an overwhelming offense based on unshakable facts. "Vice President Harris," she began, her voice eerily calm in a way that made everyone in the studio lean forward in anticipation. "I appreciate you sharing your perspective on experience and effectiveness. Since you brought up our respective records, let's talk about them." Harris's smirk grew wider, completely misreading the situation. She thought she had won, that Crockett was about to engage in exactly the kind of defensive response that would make her look weak and inexperienced. She had no idea what was coming next. "You're absolutely right that experience matters," Crockett continued, her tone still conversational, but with an edge that anyone who had watched her committee appearances would recognize as the prelude to complete destruction. "So let's talk about your experience. As California's Attorney General, you fought to keep people in prison even after courts found they were wrongfully convicted. You defended California's death penalty in court, while claiming publicly that you opposed it. You sent parents to jail for their kids' truancy, while your own office was truant on justice for the people who needed it most." The studio went dead silent. Harris's smirk evaporated faster than water in the desert, replaced by a look of shock that she couldn't quite hide despite years of media training. Anderson Cooper's pen stopped moving across his notepad as he realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. The camera operators instinctively zoomed in, capturing every micro-expression as one of the most powerful politicians in America was systematically dismantled on live television. Crockett was just getting started, her voice gaining strength and conviction as she methodically laid out a case that she had been building for months. "You want to talk about putting criminals behind bars? Let's talk about how you put marijuana users behind bars by the thousands while laughing about smoking weed yourself on radio shows. Let's talk about how you kept people in prison past their release dates to use them as cheap labor for California. Let's talk about how you built your career on the backs of people who looked like me while claiming to be a champion of criminal justice reform." Harris tried to interrupt, her voice weak and defensive. "That's not." But Crockett wasn't about to let her derail this train of facts that was about to run over her entire political legacy. "I'm not finished, Madam Vice President," Crockett said firmly, using Harris's title in a way that somehow managed to sound both respectful and devastating at the same time. "You questioned my effectiveness? In 2 years, I've passed more meaningful criminal justice legislation than you did in 4 years in the Senate. While you were calculating your next political move and figuring out which way the wind was blowing, I was in the trenches defending people who couldn't afford million-dollar legal teams. The destruction was surgical in its precision, each fact delivered with the kind of calm authority that comes from someone who has done their homework and knows they're right." Crockett had clearly studied every aspect of Harris's record, and she was using that knowledge to devastating effect. "You want to talk about experience? My experience is watching you campaign as a progressive prosecutor and then govern as someone who threw progressive values under the bus the moment it became politically convenient. My experience is watching you promise criminal justice reform and then sit silently while the system you helped build continued to destroy communities across this country." Harris's face was turning red, a combination of anger and embarrassment that she couldn't hide despite all her years of media training. She was clearly unprepared for this level of detailed, factual assault from someone she had dismissed as a lightweight. "You attacked my effectiveness," Crockett continued, her voice rising slightly as she sensed her opponent's weakness. "But let's talk about yours as vice president. What exactly did you accomplish? The border crisis you were supposed to solve? Still a mess. Voting rights legislation you promised to champion? Dead in the water. Climate change action that you said was an existential threat? Minimal progress at best. Infrastructure that you said would transform America? Watered down beyond recognition." Then came the moment that would be clipped, shared, and quoted for years to come. Crockett looked directly into the camera, then back at Harris with an expression of pure steel that conveyed both disappointment and determination. "Vice President Harris, you said I should listen to those who've actually done the work. Here's the thing, I have done the work. I've been in courtrooms fighting for justice while you were in boardrooms cutting deals with the system that oppresses our people. I've been fighting for bail reform while you were defending a system that kept poor people in jail because they couldn't afford to buy their freedom." She paused for dramatic effect, and in that moment of silence, you could hear the collective intake of breath from everyone in the studio. This was the kind of political moment that comes along once in a generation, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something historic. "The difference between us isn't experience, Kamala," Crockett said, using Harris's first name in a way that stripped away all the titles and pretense and made this personal. "The difference is that when I fight for justice, I actually mean it. You fight for whatever polls well that week. You speak to focus groups. I speak to people. You calculate your positions based on what will advance your career. I base mine on what will advance justice. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the barely audible sound of Harris's papers rustling as her hands trembled slightly. Crockett wasn't done yet. The people don't need another politician who talks progressive and governs conservative. They don't need someone who promises change and delivers incrementalism. They need someone who will actually fight for them, not someone who will fight for whatever helps them climb the next rung of the political ladder. And clearly, that someone isn't you. Harris was visibly shaken. Her composure completely shattered. Her hands were trembling as she gripped her notes, and her voice cracked slightly when she tried to respond. Congresswoman Crockett, you're being incredibly disrespectful. Disrespectful? Crockett's voice rose for the first time, and the passion that had been simmering beneath her calm exterior finally broke through. What's disrespectful is pretending to be a champion of criminal justice reform, while your record shows the exact opposite. What's disrespectful is attacking my qualifications when your own record can't stand up to scrutiny. What's disrespectful is dismissing the concerns of young voters and progressive activists as mere Twitter noise when they're asking for the change you promised and failed to deliver. Crockett pulled out her phone in what seemed like a casual move but was clearly calculated for maximum impact. The gesture was so unexpected and bold that it sent a ripple of whispers through the studio audience. You know what? Let me read something to you, she said, scrolling through her phone with the confidence of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment. This is from your own 2020 campaign website, where you promised to end mass incarceration, reform the criminal justice system, and fight for equal justice under law. How's that working out? Because from where I sit, it looks like you forgot those promises the moment it became politically inconvenient to keep them. She looked back up at Harris with devastating calm, her voice dropping to just above a whisper but carrying clearly throughout the studio. Maybe instead of attacking freshman congresswomen who are actually trying to keep those promises, you should spend some time figuring out why your approval ratings are in free fall and why young voters have completely given up on you. Maybe you should ask yourself why people like me have to exist in the first place because people like you failed them. Harris tried one last desperate comeback, her voice shaky and lacking conviction. I think this conversation shows exactly why experience matters in leadership, but Crockett cut her off with surgical precision, delivering the final blow that would end Harris's political aspirations forever. No, Kamala, this conversation shows exactly why authenticity matters in leadership, and that's something you lost a long time ago if you ever had it in the first place. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Harris sat there, clearly defeated, looking like she had just been hit by a truck that she never saw coming. Crockett maintained her composure like a champion boxer who had just delivered a knockout punch and was waiting for the referee to count to 10. Anderson Cooper finally found his voice, though it took him several seconds to process what he had just witnessed. We'll be right back after this break. But everyone in that studio knew the fight was already over, and the winner was sitting calmly in her purple blazer, having just delivered one of the most devastating political takedowns in television history. Before the commercial break was even over, clips from the confrontation were already spreading across social media platforms like wildfire in dry brush. The speed of the viral spread was unprecedented in modern political history, demonstrating just how hungry the American public was for authentic political discourse and genuine accountability. The hashtag number Crockett destroys Kamala was trending on Twitter within 15 minutes of the segment ending, eventually reaching over 2.5 million mentions by the end of the night. TikTok users were creating compilation videos of Crockett's best lines before most Americans had even finished watching the original segment. Instagram stories exploded with reaction memes and screenshots of Harris's shocked expression. Facebook groups that had been dormant for months suddenly came alive with thousands of people sharing the clips and debating what this meant for the future of the Democratic Party. The moment that truly broke the internet was a 30-second clip of Crockett saying, "The difference between us isn't experience, Kamala. The difference is that when I fight for justice, I actually mean it." Within 2 hours, that single clip had over 2 million views across all platforms, and by morning, it would reach 15 million views, making it one of the most watched political moments in social media history. Conservative commentators were having an absolute field day, sharing the clip with comments like, Even Democrats are calling out Kamala's hypocrisy. And this is what happens when progressive chickens come home to roost. They were gleefully amplifying the footage, not because they agreed with Crockett's progressive politics, but because they loved watching Democrats tear each other apart on national television. Fox News played the clip on loop for 3 straight hours, with different hosts offering commentary on what they called the complete destruction of Kamala Harris's political career. But the real celebration was happening on progressive Twitter, where activists who had been waiting for someone to call out Harris's record were treating this as vindication of everything they had been saying for years. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, quote, tweeted the clip with flame emojis and the comment, "When you come for someone, you better not miss." Bernie Sanders supporters were declaring Crockett the future of the progressive movement, with one popular account tweeting, "This is what happens when authentic leaders meet fake ones." The engagement numbers were absolutely staggering by any measure. The original CNN segment got 15 million views on YouTube in the first 24 hours, making it the most watched political interview in the network's history. TikTok compilations were averaging 500,000 views each, with some reaching over 2 million views. Twitter engagement was through the roof, with the hashtag generating over 100,000 tweets in the first 6 hours alone. More importantly for the political implications, the sentiment analysis was devastating for Harris. Comment sections were overwhelmingly pro-Crockett, with viewers praising her authenticity, her preparation, and her willingness to speak truth to power. Even traditionally pro-Harris accounts were struggling to defend her performance, with many simply going silent rather than trying to spin what everyone could see was a complete political evisceration. Behind the scenes, Democratic Party leaders were in full panic mode. Nancy Pelosi's office was reportedly fielding dozens of calls from major donors, asking what this meant for party unity and whether Harris was still viable as a future presidential candidate. Chuck Schumer was trying to downplay the confrontation as a spirited policy debate between two passionate leaders, but party insiders knew this was much bigger than a policy disagreement. This was a public execution of Harris's political credibility by one of the party's rising stars, and it had happened on the most watched cable news network in America. The optics were terrible for Harris, and potentially catastrophic for a party that was already struggling with internal divisions between its establishment and progressive wings. Harris's team moved quickly to try to control the narrative, releasing a statement within hours, saying the vice president appreciated the passionate discussion about criminal justice reform and looked forward to working with all Democratic leaders to advance progressive priorities. They tried to frame the exchange as evidence of the party's big tent that could accommodate different perspectives and approaches to shared goals. But the damage was done, and everyone in Washington knew it. Harris's attempt to project strength and experience had backfired spectacularly. Instead of looking like a seasoned leader schooling a rookie, she looked like an out-of-touch politician who had been thoroughly outclassed by someone younger, smarter, and more authentic. The video clips showed her visibly shaken, unprepared, and defense exactly the opposite of the strong leadership image she had been trying to cultivate. The meme creation was instant and merciless, showing just how deeply the moment had penetrated popular culture. Images of Harris's shocked face were paired with Crockett's most devastating quotes. GIFs of Crockett's calm demeanor while delivering verbal destruction became Twitter favorites. One particularly viral meme showed Crockett as a chess master with the caption, "When you think you're playing checkers but she's playing 4D chess." Another showed Harris with the caption, "When you try to school someone but end up getting a PhD in humiliation." Other members of Congress were weighing in carefully, trying to navigate the political implications of such a public intra-party conflict. Progressive caucus members were subtly showing support for Crockett through social media likes and retweets, while establishment Democrats were notably silent, clearly unsure how to respond to one of their own taking down the former VP so decisively. Republican lawmakers were having fun with it, sharing clips and making jokes about Democratic infighting. "Maybe Democrats should focus less on attacking us and more on figuring out their own house," tweeted Senator Ted Cruz, while Representative Matt Gaetz posted simply, "Fatality," with a GIF from the video game Mortal Kombat. Political analysts were already calling this a watershed moment for the Democratic Party. It represented everything that was wrong with the establishment, wing the condescension, the fake progressivism, the sense of entitlement that turned off so many voters who were looking for authentic leadership rather than calculated political theater. Within 48 hours, Jasmine Crockett had become the most talked-about politician in America not named Trump. Speaking requests were pouring in from universities, advocacy groups, and media outlets. Progressive organizations were reaching out about endorsements and speaking engagements. Her fundraising numbers spiked immediately, with small-dollar donations pouring in from across the country at a rate that surprised even her experienced campaign staff. She had gone from being a respected but relatively unknown congresswoman to a national political figure in the span of one CNN appearance. Political insiders were already floating her name for higher office, with speculation about potential Senate runs or even presidential ambitions in future cycles. The late-night comedy shows had a field day with the footage. Saturday Night Live was already writing sketches about the confrontation. Stephen Colbert dedicated his entire opening monologue to the exchange, playing clips and marveling at Crockett's surgical precision. "I've seen political takedowns before," Colbert joked, "but this was like watching a masterclass in how to destroy someone's career in under 5 minutes. Jimmy Kimmel showed the clip 3 times during his monologue, each time with increasing amazement. "You know it's bad when you can actually see someone's political career ending in real time," he said to massive applause from his studio audience. Even international media picked up the story, with the BBC running a segment about generational tensions in American politics, and French news outlets analyzing what this meant for American democracy. The clip was being shared across the globe as an example of authentic political discourse versus calculated political theater. For Kamala Harris, the damage appeared to be irreparable. Political insiders were already writing her political obituary. "This was the moment Harris's presidential ambitions died," wrote one prominent Democratic strategist in a widely shared blog post. "You can't come back from being publicly humiliated like that by someone in your own party, especially when the humiliation was so thoroughly deserved." Her approval ratings, which had already been struggling, took another significant hit in the polls conducted immediately after the confrontation. Young voters, who had already been abandoning her in large numbers, now saw her as everything they hated about establishment politics. The viral nature of her humiliation meant millions of people who might never have heard of Jasmine Crockett now knew exactly who she was, and they loved her for standing up to Harris. This confrontation represented something much bigger than just 2 politicians disagreeing about policy. It showed that American voters were hungry for authenticity, tired of calculated political performances, and ready to support leaders who would actually fight for their values, rather than just talk about them during election seasons. Crockett had demonstrated that experience without authenticity was worthless, that careful political calculation was no match for genuine conviction, and that sometimes the best way to deal with a condescending authority figure was to fight back with facts, passion, and unwavering principle. The ripple effects of this confrontation extended far beyond the immediate political implications. Within a week, 3 major polling organizations had conducted surveys about the exchange, and the results were devastating for Harris. Among Democratic voters under 40, her favorability rating dropped by 23 points. Among African American women, a demographic she had long counted as part of her base, her numbers fell by 18 points. Most damaging of all, among the progressive activists who formed the backbone of the Democratic Party's grassroots organizing efforts, her approval rating plummeted to just 12%. The Harris-Crockett confrontation became required viewing in political science classes across the country, with professors using it as a case study in how quickly political fortunes can change in the modern media environment. Communication experts analyzed Crockett's technique, noting how she had used specific facts rather than general accusations, maintained emotional control, while still showing passion, and turned Harris's own words against her with devastating effectiveness. Business schools began incorporating the exchange into their curricula as an example of crisis management and the importance of preparation. "This is what happens when someone comes to a gunfight with a knife," explained one Harvard Business School professor. Harris thought her credentials would be enough, but Crockett had done her homework and was ready for every possible attack. The entertainment industry took notice as well. Netflix announced plans for a documentary about the rise of authentic political voices in the social media age. with Crockett's confrontation with Harris serving as the centerpiece. Hollywood agents were reportedly reaching out to Crockett about book deals and speaking engagements, recognizing that she had become a cultural phenomenon that transcended traditional political boundaries. Social media platforms saw the exchange as validation of their importance in modern political discourse. Twitter executives pointed to the immediate viral spread as evidence that their platform remained essential for political communication. TikTok highlighted how young users had embraced Crockett's message, creating thousands of response videos that used her quotes as inspiration for their own messages about authenticity and standing up to authority. The impact on political fundraising was immediate and dramatic. Crockett's campaign coffers swelled with donations from across the country, many of them from first-time political contributors who had been inspired by her performance. Progressive organizations saw their membership rolls expand, as people sought ways to support leaders who shared Crockett's commitment to authentic advocacy. Meanwhile, Harris found herself increasingly isolated within her own party. Major donors began distancing themselves from her political operation, worried that association with her damaged brand might hurt their other political investments. Several high-profile fundraisers that had been planned for the following month were quietly cancelled or postponed indefinitely. The confrontation also had international implications that nobody had anticipated. Progressive movements in other countries began sharing the clip as inspiration for their own efforts to challenge establishment politicians. European politicians studied Crockett's technique, recognizing that the same dynamics of authenticity versus calculation existed in their own political systems. Foreign policy experts noted that the exchange had damaged America's soft power by highlighting the deep divisions within the Democratic Party. Authoritarian leaders around the world used the footage as evidence that American democracy was fundamentally broken, pointing to the spectacle of two prominent Democrats destroying each other on television as proof that the American political system was too chaotic to provide global leadership. The media coverage continued for weeks, with new angles and analyses appearing daily. Conservative outlets continued to amplify the footage, while liberal publications struggled to find ways to defend Harris without appearing to attack Crockett's progressive credentials. The result was a sustained period of negative coverage for Harris that further cemented the narrative of her political decline. Academic researchers began studying the exchange as an example of how social media had fundamentally changed political communication. The speed with which clips spread, the way memes shaped public perception, and the role of viral moments in determining political fortunes all became subjects of scholarly investigation. The Crockett-Harris confrontation also influenced the strategies of other politicians, who recognized that the old rules of political engagement no longer applied. Young politicians began studying Crockett's technique, while establishment figures became more cautious about directly challenging rising stars who might be better prepared than they appeared. The personal toll on Harris became increasingly evident in her subsequent public appearances. She seemed less confident, more defensive, and noticeably more careful in her interactions with other Democratic leaders. The woman who had once projected effortless authority now appeared to be second-guessing herself at every turn. For Crockett, the victory came with its own challenges. She found herself under intense scrutiny from both supporters and opponents, with every statement and vote analyzed for signs of whether she could live up to the expectations created by her viral moment. The pressure to maintain her authentic voice, while operating in an increasingly complex political environment, required careful navigation. The story of Kamala Harris attacking Jasmine Crockett and receiving a savage comeback that broke the internet ultimately became more than just a political moment. It became a cultural touchstone that represented the changing nature of American political discourse, the power of authentic communication, and the importance of being prepared when challenging authority. Years later, political historians would mark this confrontation as a turning point in American politics, the moment when the old establishment learned that credentials and experience were no longer enough to guarantee respect or authority. In an age when voters could fact-check claims in real time and share their reactions instantly with millions of people, authenticity and preparation had become more valuable than traditional political qualifications. The lesson for anyone watching was clear and powerful. When faced with condescending authority figures who try to dismiss you based on age, experience, or status, the best response isn't emotion or personal attacks. It's preparation, facts, and unshakable confidence in your values. Crockett had shown that with the right combination of homework and heart, even the most imposing opponents could be defeated. Whether you're dealing with a difficult boss, a dismissive colleague, or anyone else who thinks they can intimidate you with their credentials, remember Jasmine Crockett's lesson from that CNN studio. Authenticity and preparation will always triumph over arrogance and assumption. The truth, when delivered with conviction and backed by facts, is the most powerful weapon in any confrontation. Thanks for staying with us through this incredible political moment that changed everything we thought we knew about power dynamics in American politics. If you want to see more breakdowns of the most explosive political confrontations and the strategies behind viral moments that reshape the political landscape, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest content. Drop a comment below and let us know what you thought of Crockett's epic takedown and who you think might be her next target as she continues to shake up the establishment. The political landscape is shifting faster than ever, and authentic voices like hers are leading the charge toward a more honest and accountable form of political discourse. You definitely won't want to miss what happens next in this rapidly evolving story of American democracy.